In this presentation I'm going to introduce the most important theoretical foundation for productivity and rent that the property economist should be aware of, and that is Ricardo's law of rent. And it's really from Ricardo's law of rent we get the whole understanding of where property value comes from and how it behaves. But what my purpose is in this presentation is merely to introduce the mechanics of it. I'm going to do that by using the same example that Ricardo introduced when he described his theory back in 1815 and gave us what is now known as Ricardo's law of rent. Ricardo realized that the perfect market could not give you a value for land, for reasons that we've seen elsewhere. But land is a very valuable element in the economy, and so it must get its value from somewhere. And this is the question which has puzzled political economists and economists for some time. The example that Ricardo used to explain the behavior of value and productivity was to look at the example of rent in a new country, in a new colony, or some place where some user of land, let's say a colonist going out into the South Pacific or to Australia in the late 1700s, ready to go and use the land productively, let's say as a farmer. And this example has the advantage of being able to free us from the complexity of our current economy, which has now got, in Australia at least, 2 centuries of land dealings and economic history sort of layered on top of layer. So it becomes very difficult to see what the essential source of land value is. And so what we're going to do is look at what would happen. We're going to ask the question, what would it be like? How would you behave with the opportunity of moving into an area where there is lots of land and no people? And this is the question that Ricardo put to his readers in 1815. Basically, if you found yourself sailing up a river as a new settler in some remote colony, you would be presented with the prospects of being able to settle anywhere you like. And because it's a new colony, you wouldn't have to buy the land. You would simply pull ashore and whatever you wanted, you could occupy. And that's what happened in Australia, basically. In that situation, what you would see in front of you is a vast variety of qualities of productive land. If you're a farmer, you would tend to go for the level, deep soils that you find on river flats, especially since the river flats are adjacent the water, so you've got a water supply, you've got transport links, you've got all of those advantages, plus the deep soil. And so we'll call that first quality land. Now, the extraordinary thing about that is that you're able to pull your boat ashore and take as much of this very productive land as you like. But oddly enough, in that situation, what Ricardo recognized is that it would come to you for free, even though it's very productive. And so this idea we have that productivity equals land value equals land price or what have you is actually quite artificial, because the productivity of land is not necessarily connected to its price. And this example, only 200 years old, is a very good illustration of that, the distinction between productivity and price. There is a second peculiarity about this situation that I'll mention without going too far into it, and that is, in this situation there is no economic incentive for a new settler to take more land than they are able to manage themselves. And the reason is that land in this case does not represent an investment, it represents more of a burden, because if I take more land than I need, I find myself having to clear and fence and care for more land than I'm physically able to, and that isn't particularly attractive. However, we won't explore the implications of this too far, except to point out that the economics of that for the entire community actually produces a more healthy outcome, where you have the larger proportion of the community as small landowners. And generally it's been accepted by economists that the most efficient economy is one where you have as large a number of people being small landowners as possible, which is kind of the opposite to what we see in the bigger and better kind of mentality that dominates today. Let's return now to considering our little mental experiment. Imagine that you are now sailing up the river into this new area where you've got all of this productive land which is for free, and you're considering where to full ashore, what land to take up, and that will become your future property investment and so on. And let's see what you would do and what the implications are as that community increase. And away you go. And sure enough, you're going to have to put some human labour into the land, so you might clear it and fence it. And then after that, whatever latent productivity is in the land itself will then be available to you in terms of the fertility of the soil, the productivity in terms of crops. And all of the product you'll be able to sell, and because you're not paying off the bank, you're not paying off a landlord, you're not sort of buying it from anyone else, all of the income that you get from using that land goes into your pocket. Now, that sounds very attractive, and today if I was to offer anyone who's listening to this presentation free productive land, they'd probably jump at it. But it's curious, you see, because here is productive land with no price tag. It's absolutely free. That's a curiosity, a paradox almost, in our thinking. However, it's worth remembering that that's quite possible. And you see it sometimes in the case of ghost towns, but that will really take us into a different topic. To further illustrate the fact that this productive land has no price, no value, consider what happens if another boatload of settlers comes sailing up the river, knocks on our door, says, "Oh, that's a very nice farm that you've got established here. May I buy it from you?" The problem you have is that if you go to sell it to them for any price, which is above the depreciated value of the capital improvements that you've put in using your labour, that new settler would say, "Thank you very much, but I'll just go up the river and I'll put my own labour into another piece of virgin land, and I'll have exactly what you've got, and in fact it'll be cheaper because you're trying to ask a price not for your human labour, but for the land itself, and I can get land itself absolutely free just up the river." And so those new settlers will tend to go and find somewhere else, and they'll become your neighbours, and you'll both be landowners. Likewise, it will be very difficult in that kind of an environment to be able to have employees. And the reason for this is that if someone comes sailing up the river and you wave them ashore and say, "Look, I need a farmhand here to go and help me because I've got a big spread here," they'll say, "That's all very nice, but I'd prefer the security and independence of having my own property, thank you very much. And what is it that you can offer me that I can't get by simply going upriver and getting out of my boat and occupying this free land which is available merely for the taking?" And of course you'll just be left there with your mouth open. Finding employees will be very difficult in that environment. Of course, psychologically there are some people who prefer to work for others rather than have the independence of being able to set up for themselves, but relatively speaking they're fairly light on the ground. We'll assume that most people would take the opportunity of owning their own home, which after all is the Australian dream. Okay, so what we can see here is that we've got very productive land with absolutely no price. Now, there's an economic spin-off that comes from this happening, and that is because the occupants of the land, the people who are using the land, have all of the income from the land, all of the productivity going into their pockets. It looks to them like wages. It looks like personal profit for their farming businesses, and they're going to be able to spend that all on themselves. Now, the significance of this is not so much for themselves, they'll live comfortably enough, but the advantage is for those people that supply them with the goods and services that they need. That might be the furniture builders, the weavers and the tailors who make their clothes, the suppliers of machinery for their farms and so on. And because these farmers have this highly productive land which is earning them good incomes, they're going to be stimulating these remote economies. In the Australian situation, they would be the agents, importers, manufacturers and tradesmen who were in the settlements such as Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and so on. Okay. In this kind of situation, you're left wondering, well, where does the value of land come from? Because we've got this productive land with no price. A real estate agent wouldn't have very much work to do in this environment, and a property manager would have even less to do, because you wouldn't be able to rent land to anybody, because if someone comes along saying, I would like to use this land that belongs to you, you wouldn't be able to charge them rent, because if you tried to, they would simply do the same as everyone else, move upstream, take their own land, occupy land just like yours, without paying rent. So there's no rent. Where does rent come from? This is the question that we now have. Is this example I've given you something a little bit bizarre and unrealistic? Well, it's certainly not bizarre and unrealistic as much as it's foreign in the 21st century. The origin of rent comes only when sufficient numbers of people come sailing up the river that eventually all of the first quality land is occupied. And so there will be a settler who will arrive and suddenly find that the only land available is noticeably inferior to the first quality of land that everyone has been occupying so far. We'll call this second-class land, or level 2 land. What that means is they'll be able to come ashore, they'll be able to take that land. It mightn't be quite as fertile as the river-fronting flats that you've taken. It may not have access to the river. Whatever it has, it's going to be just a little bit less productive. Now, that settler has a choice of either coming ashore and taking the land for free, which is at that second level of productivity, the lower level of productivity, or they can come along to you and say, may I rent your land, please? I notice that you're now getting a bit old and you want to retire. And you'll be able to say to them, well, I am thinking of leaving the land. I like this property and all of the normal sort of guff that people go on with when they negotiate for property. But essentially, when it gets down to business, you'll be able to charge them rent equal to the difference in productivity between the land that they can get for free and your land, which is more productive. And so if your land can produce, let's say, 100 bushels of wheat for a particular area, and the land that they're able to get for free is only able to produce 80, that means that each year you would be able to charge them 20 bushels of wheat. They would be willing to pay it because they really have that free choice of whether to get the 80 bushels off their free land or the 80 bushels, which comes as 100 minus 20 off yours. So there's a certain level of indifference there. What this shows us is that once we've run out of the first quality land, and after all, land is limited in supply, we can't get any more of it. There's only so much river frontage land on the Fitzroy River or the Brisbane River or whatever river you want to consider. Once we're pushed onto the second level, then the first level land gains a rental value. Now notice the distinction between the rental value of this land and its productivity. We are saying that the first quality land, which we'll assume you've got, produces the 100 bushels of wheat. So its productivity is 100. Its rent is only 20. And so what we see is that the notion of productivity, material physical productivity, is not the same as the notion of rental potential. And this is a distinction that I'd like you to be wary of now as you read through Tom Whipple's book. Because while Whipple's text is an excellent valuation text, he tends to use this notion of productivity quite inappropriately. Because really when Whipple says productivity, he's actually saying capacity to produce a rental income. He very seldom focuses on the actual physical productivity of the land. However, the only reason that someone is a tenant on your land is because in some way it's going to produce something useful for them. If someone rents a farm from you, it's because that farm will be able to grow so many cows or so many sheep or so much wheat. If they rent a shop from you, it's not because they simply want to look at the thing. It's because they're going to be able to run a business which is going to be able to produce a certain amount of business income, of business revenue. It's productive to the extent that the shop will produce a revenue. In a kind of way, residential property is also productive. It doesn't actually produce dollars, but it produces the pleasure and comfort of providing shelter for the occupants, for the tenants. And so all of property is always occupied because of some benefit that it brings to the human occupant, the human user, whether it's productive property like farms, shops, factories and offices, or whether it's simply for living in, like residential. Now, this problem with the limited supply of land will continue as the population continues to rise. And one of the advantages of using this example of a new settlement is that ultimately we have most control over the population. We begin with a microscopic population and we'll eventually build up to something like a reasonable farming population. And we can see that as we do, eventually we're going to run out of not just the first quality land and the second quality land and pushed out onto the third quality land. We are conceivably going to be pushed out further and further, and at each point the productivity of the free land is going to be lower. The curious thing is that as each lower level of productivity is used, each inferior quality land is used, it means that the people that settle on that and take it up are willing to live on a lower personal income. Just think about that. Those farmers, those new settlers coming up the river, are forced onto, let's say, grade 3 land, and that means that it's not going to produce nearly as much as the grade 1 land produced when we first sailed up the river. However, it still produces quite a comfortable amount to be able to provide for the labour unit. By the way, when we're talking about labour units, especially in these situations, the correct understanding for a labour unit is the household. And in the political economy of David Ricardo, a household consisted of a man, a wife, and 2 children. And the idea was that the 2 children eventually would grow up and they'd become a husband and wife, and the whole thing would continue on in a stable way over time. And that's normally considered to be the labour unit. And we find that especially important when you start to explore residential property markets a little bit further, because the appropriate unit of occupation is the household, not the individual. However, as we look at what's happening here, as the occupants are being forced onto lower and lower levels of productivity, what it means is that their net income is being reduced. And that's fairly simple, because you're going to be on some fairly stony, arid kind of land eventually, and it means that you're going to have to spend all of your time, all of your labour resources, simply producing just enough to live on. You won't have very much left over. If we look back on our diagram here, we see that as we're moving on to the lower levels of productivity, the rents on the more productive land are actually increasing. Now notice this. The rents on the more productive land are increasing, however the productivity of the more productive land is not changing. Again, this illustrates the distinction between rental product, the capacity of land to produce a rent, and the actual physical product, the benefits from actually occupying it, as a farm, as a factory, and so on. And so what we can see is that rents can grow even though productivity does not necessarily grow. And in this example, we're assuming that we're not really bothering about farm technology changing at all. We can look at that a bit later on. Another curiosity about this is that the occupant of the lowest level of land in use has a certain amount of income going into their pocket, because that has the effect of increasing the rent on the more productive land. The tenants on the more productive land actually have a net income equal to the income of the person settling on the least productive land in operation. You notice the level line across the top of those yellow bars. This is really, really important, because what it says is that in a perfect market, in a perfectly mobile, informed market, the rents will be raised to the point where they take the marginal product. And so the net product, the product that the occupant is left with, will be the same, whether they're a tenant on grade 1, grade 2, grade whatever, right down to the land which is out there on the margin. The fact that there is this levelling of the net income to the occupant has led to the expression wages line, to describe the way that the return to the occupants of the land, the people actually running businesses and feeding their families and acting as farmers or running their businesses, whatever they're doing, this wages line is constant across the economy. And it means that those people who work either running businesses or doing some directly productive activity like being a property valuer or something is pretty much equal. Maybe there's always going to be sort of differences in terms of the skill of the job and the demand for the service and that sort of thing. But there's this equation of it regardless of where you practice. To illustrate this, for instance, imagine that you're going to run a hairdressing shop, a hairdressing business, and you have two possible locations. One is a very busy central CBD area, or maybe in the middle of a very busy shopping complex or what have you, where there's lots of footfall, lots of people walking past, especially lots of people who are employed and wealthy, compared to another location where you can have your shop, which is some sleepy little country town somewhere. Or let's say we take a middle ground, a suburban location. This rental theory would suggest that in a perfectly informed market, if all the property economists are doing their jobs, the person considering that business would be likely to earn the same business income regardless of whether they set up in the busy CBD location or in the suburban location or even out in the sleepy country town. The difference will be that they will be working a lot harder in the CBD, but they'll be paying a lot more rent. Whereas in the sleepy regional town, they won't be doing very much business, but they won't be paying much rent either. Those of you who have any experience in retailing and retail centres and so on, lease negotiations and so on, will be quite aware of the way that rents are quite aggressively crafted to take the marginal profit away from the tenant, especially when we're talking about the specialty tenants. And this comes directly from Ricardo's law of rent, this equating of the net income from the tenant. We call that the wages line, this horizontal line that's running across the top of these blue bars in our example. But really it's more than just a wages line. It is a line which equates all of the returns for not just wages but also entrepreneurial profits. And that is, I might have a hairdressing salon that employs half a dozen people, and so most of my income is the profit from running my business. But even though I'm running a business and I'm earning a profit, so I'm not strictly speaking labour, the profit from my business is going to be equated using the same dynamics of rent that we have here in our wages line. So the wages line really balances, equates, levels the returns to labour and enterprise, all of the directly productive parts of the economy. This process will continue on as the population increases, and the population eventually will occupy all of the available land. Land being fixed in supply and spatially set in stone, literally. The point will come where you get to a boundary. You will either run out of land, you'll run out of Australia or New Zealand or whatever the country is that you're in, or you might get to a political boundary. You might get to the edge of Poland, or the edge of Germany, or the edge of Mexico, or whatever, and you simply can't go any further. At that point you've hit a boundary. Now it's important for us to understand the dynamics of what happens when you run out of available land. In the early parts of this example, we're looking at a situation where you simply sail up the river, hop out, and you just go walking until you find the edge of where human occupation happens. That's called the frontier. But Today, in the 21st century, there aren't very many open frontiers about. They're all closed. What happens when the frontier closes? This is the last part of this puzzle, but it's a very, very important part. It happens like this. Once the frontier closes, it means that there are private property rights allocated to all of the property resources in this community. It means that anybody wanting to use the land as a tenant must be using somebody else's land. Now, at that point, we come back to what Adam Smith observed, was that land essentially and always operates as a monopoly, because the landowners at that point are able to see that that extra tenant actually needs access to the land, because without it they can't be a farmer, or they can't be a shop owner, or they can't run their factory or what have you. It's an absolute necessity because of the physical realities of people in the physical real economy. Why is that important? Because it means that the landowner is able to say, either you pay the rent I choose, or you don't run your business, or you don't feed your family, or whatever. If you're dealing with real human people rather than economic actors, this means you either pay the rent that's being asked for, or you starve to death. What this means is that rents are able to move fairly rapidly from simply being determined by the productivity of the least productive land in use to a level where the landlord is able to ask all of the productivity above that personal income which is needed to simply keep the labour unit in some kind of simple standard of living. And that standard of living can change. What I'm saying here is that once the boundary is reached, all land will develop a rent, because the land will develop a rent which is equal to the difference between the basic cost of living and the productivity of the land. Again, we're keeping this distinction between the rent and the productivity, because rent plus income to the tenant equals the productivity. How much income do we give the tenant? Well, only just enough to keep them. Only just enough for them to reach the standard of living which in this particular society is considered reasonable. It means that if I'm running my hairdressing salon and I'm employing my 5 people or what have you, I do expect to have a higher income than my employees. Otherwise I wouldn't be bothered running the business and taking all the risks and paying the payroll tax and all the rest of it. But even within that, the amount of profit that I'm going to have and the amount of income that I'm able to distribute between myself and my employees is going to be determined not primarily by the value of land, because remember, land has no intrinsic value. It's rather that the value of land is going to be worked out in terms of how little me and my employees are willing to accept as wages. What this means is that once we have a closed frontier, we have a boundary on our property market, land rent is determined as the difference between productivity and the community's understanding of the minimum level of income needed for the standard of living which is considered socially acceptable. That's a fairly complicated definition, but it's an important one to put in at this point, because if we don't, we can end up making a few mistakes. The important thing about this definition is that it includes a sensitivity for the fact that different communities have different understandings of what an acceptable lower level of standard of living is for tenants, for the ordinary working person. In Australia, for instance, the ordinary working person expects to be able to go home at night and go into a house or a home unit or something where there will be glass in the windows, usually carpet on the floors, water flowing through the taps, both hot and cold. They'll expect to be able to have a television to look at, maybe a computer to play with, and certainly a telephone to sort of follow them around all the time. This is what we would consider to be a basic standard of living. Oh, and usually a motor car in the garage as well. Other parts of the world, say especially to contrast to Africa, the idea of having glass in the windows would be quite a luxury. However, life goes on there, a completely different rental situation. If we want to consider China, why is it that China is able to produce things so much cheaper than we do in Australia? It's largely because the standard of living of many of the Chinese workers who make everything from our iPhones to our shoes to you name it, are willing to work with incomes that give them a standard of living only a fraction of what we would consider satisfactory. However, that's for further consideration later on. The important thing about this is that what we've seen is that productivity, rent, and the return to those people that physically use the land are three heavily interrelated factors. What we'll find as we look further is that the overall productivity of the land is determined by the overall size of the population and also its economic vitality. And so land is more productive in Australia because Australia as a community has the benefits of high level of technology and high level of demand, high level of wealth and demand for our products and so on. And we also have this tradition of expecting a high standard of living for our employees and so on. But that's not necessarily the way that it works in other countries. Spend some time to go over this and consider the implications of it. Ricardo's law of rent really is the core theory to the whole of the way that property value works. It's important for you to master it, and the more you can see it in the various situations that you find yourself considering in your professional lives, the more useful it will be to you. We may be looking at some other implications of it as we go along, because it really does affect every area of property economics.